Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's host, organizer, and cat herder. We're very glad to see and hopefully hear all of you today. Let's get started. We'll begin by introducing the forum, where it comes from, how it works, who supports it, and then we'll start in with this week's guest. So, Tara, why don't you advance to the next slide, please? So you should know that the forum is a discussion-oriented platform. We're all about conversation, and we spun out of the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. If you haven't seen that, that's a monthly trends analysis that takes a look at major trends, about 86 of them, that are reshaping education technology as we know it. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, go to ftte.us and dig in. You can download a few sample copies or subscribe. Now, the forum, as well as the FTE report, are also part of the Future of Education Observatory. For the next slide, please. If you go to futureofeducation.us, you can see all kinds of projects that we do. We have the forum, we have a blog, we have a book club, we have a bookstore, we have the FTE report. The idea is to have an open, crowdsourced, participatory, social, and open look at the future of education and technology. No one person has a premium on this. We need to go looking at all of this together. So the futureofeducation.us will give you more information about that. Next slide, please. This is also a global discussion where we try to involve as many people from as many nations and continents as possible. That's because the future of education, the future of technology, truly belong to no particular nation or even region. So we should be looking for insights from Asia, Europe, South America, Africa, Australia, as well as North America. You can see from this map that we've had participants from around the world, and we're continuing to deepen that conversation. So today, as we think about the future of education, please bear in mind, this is a global discussion. Now, on to the next slide, please. Before we go further, I want to thank a few people who help support the forum and who contribute to our work going forward. So to begin with, we're very grateful to NYSERNet in New York State. This is a nonprofit that works with that state's colleges, universities, and other institutions to help get them on broadband internet. We're very grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can tell, Shindig makes available this technology we're using right now. So let me just walk you through a few of the key features of it. If you're used to video conferencing, I think there are a few unusual elements here. And again, this is about discussion. So let me show you the elements that make discussion happen. Where I am and where this slide is right now, and the slide's only going to be here for another minute, this is the stage. Everyone can see and hear what's going on the stage. And you can join us during this hour and talk with Cory and myself. We can, in fact, have up to 4 different people here, 4 different scientists, so we can really have a kind of panel going on. Now, below us is the audience space, or I think of it as the participant swarm, where you can see dozens of people, either represented by, say, a silhouette, like Valerie Bach, or a photograph, like Mark Corbett-Wilson, or an unfolding video, like Brenda right now. And you can see all those different people. In fact, if you see somebody else, you'd like to talk to them, just double-click on their icon, and your 2 icons will click together like Lego bricks, and you can have a private audio-visual conversation, which is pretty neat. Now, there are 3 ways built into this platform for you to interact with us, and we just walk you through each of these. They're all accessible from the bottom of the screen. There's a white strip running along across it. On the left edge of it, you'll see an icon that looks like a bunch of people with a number under, 45 right now. If you click on that, up will pop 2 different things. On the left side of that pop-up will be a kind of film strip view of all the participants. So you can just scroll over right now and you can see Vanessa Vale, and you can see Liz Evans, and you can see Paul and all kinds of people. So you can learn a little bit more about them. But to the right of that is the chat box. And what you type there, everybody involved in this conversation can see. So already we've been seeing Tom Hames, Vanessa Vale, making terrible jokes, Paul, Jonathan Parts, Nate Angel, all kinds of folks. So we'll be checking this text chat throughout the hour. So please use that if you'd like to have some kind of conversation or questions. We often find that people like to share things they found online by pasting a URL into that spot. Now, besides the text chat, go back to that white strip. To the right of it is a question mark in a circle. If you click that, that lets you type in a question or a comment that you would like us to read and flash on the screen. So visually, we'll copy it to the screen so everyone can see it. And then I'll read out loud so everyone can hear it. And that's a good way to ask a quick question or make a quick comment. Now, if your video camera works and your audio works and you'd like to join us on a stage, easy as can be. Back in that white strip, you'll see a raised hand icon. If you click that, that tells us that you'd like to join us on stage. So if you have all those mechanisms working, click that, and we'll bring you up on stage. It's actually quicker to do than it is to describe, and you'll see people doing it. So if you those are three different ways you can participate, three different ways that you can fling questions, comments, and thoughts. What I'm doing right now, telling you things with a slide, that's not the way we normally do things. This is just for the introduction. On top of that, if you're running Twitter off to one side, just tweet using the hashtag FTTE, and we'll be monitoring that as well. So all these are technologies, all these are functions that are part of Shindig that let you communicate, share, collaborate, and converse. We're very grateful to Shindig for making the technology available. We're also grateful to people on Patreon. If you haven't seen Patreon, it's a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, and that's a site that lets you contribute to keep some kind of creative project going. Tara, over the next slide, please. If you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you can see dozens and dozens of people that are contributing to keep my work going in the future of education and technology. So in this slide, for example, you can see everyone from Michael Slade to Joanna Richardson, Kyle Johnson, Bob Johnson, Corey S., Robin DeRosa, Jenny Kim on, Paul McConaughey, all kinds of people who contribute as little as $1 a month to keep the lights on. And the more you contribute, the more goodies we can give you. If you haven't gone there, go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander. Please consider supporting us. And we're very, very grateful to our patrons for keeping everything going. So that's who supports us. That's where the forum comes from. That's how it works. Now let's introduce this week's extraordinary guest. I'm very, very grateful to be able to have an hour to talk with Cory Doctorow. If you don't know Cory, what's wrong with you? You absolutely should. Now, on the one hand, Cory is one of the most widely known bloggers in the universe because he's been blogging at Boing Boing for a very, very long time. And Boing Boing is, of course, one of the most influential blogs in the entire world. Cory is also a longtime award-winning and very influential and, I may say, very delightful science fiction writer. He's been pumping out novels and short stories for years, winning awards and getting all kinds of eyeballs. On top of that, he's really, really keen as an activist in all kinds of issues around the digital world, including digital justice, freedom, and access. And he combines that with his work. So you can see that some of his novels are freely available for you to download. His most recent novel is one that we've been reading in our book club called Walk Away. And among other things, Walk Away portrays fascinating possibilities for alternative futures. Within those futures are many implications for education, including Walk Away University. We're delighted to have him here to talk about all of these. And I'm really delighted to have you share your questions and thoughts. So, Tara, why don't we bring down the slides and bring up Cory, and we can begin. Greetings, Cory. I should say good morning, right?
Yeah, still morning here in California.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it's terrific for you to be here. I'm really, really grateful and very excited. Thank you for having the time to join us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, terrific, terrific. Just to begin, if I could, looking ahead to the next half of a year, 2018, what are the big projects and themes that you're working on now? Is there another novel we should expect, or more activism, or what?
Well, in terms of political or technical campaigns, I just helped the nonprofit I work with, Electronic Frontier Foundation, file comments with the U.S. Copyright Office over an obscure but unbelievably important regulatory proceeding about something called Section 1201 of the DMCA. This is the rule from 1998 that says that if you have a copyright lock, you're not allowed to bypass that copyright lock, even if the lock is on something you own and you want to do something legal with it. So, for example, if you want to fix your own car and you want to read diagnostics out of the engine, GM and the other auto manufacturers, they lock the data from your car up behind a copyright lock, and you can't get at that data to fix your car, or mechanics can't do it. And so it effectively allows manufacturers to monopolize all of the elements of their supply chain, including parts and service. And, it's inkjet printers increasingly to lock in inkjet printers. But most importantly, releasing any information that might weaken one of these locks is a potential felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. And that means that security researchers are now confronted with this ever-growing constellation of devices whose security they can't investigate and warn us about. And that's everything from pacemakers to cars to thermostats, baby monitors, voting machines, implanted artificial pancreases, neural implants. I mean, they're all potentially vulnerable. They're all just badly secure general purpose computers that we really need to be able to freely audit. So we just filed these comments with the U.S. Copyright Office, and we continue to work on a campaign to keep pressure on them. This week, I published a short story by John Scalzi, a fellow science fiction writer, about one of the exemptions we applied for. We have 2 more of these short stories that we'll be publishing in the next couple of weeks. And we have the catalog of missing devices, which is a kind of design experiment or design fiction thought experiment of devices that should exist but don't because of this law and overreach. So that's my major policy fight right now. Obviously, I'm involved tangentially in the net neutrality fight. My frank view is that it would be pretty surprising if Congress were to tell the FCC to restore net neutrality. But on the other hand, we have an election coming up. I think that getting elected officials on the record about where they stand on net neutrality will make net neutrality a potential election issue. It gives their opponents something to hit them with in a couple of months. And then in terms of writing, I'm finishing a third Little Brother novel at the moment, and I've got a couple of novellas I've just finished that will be coming out in the next couple of months. And I got a new short story I'm working on. What else? In 2019 or 2020, I have a picture book coming out called Posey the Monster Slayer, and I'm doing something here. Well, anyway, there's a rather long. Oh yeah, the paperbacks of Walk Away and all my adult novels are coming out later this month. They're reissuing all my adult novels in covers that match Walk Away.
Neat!
Really lovely.
That orange kind of elegant icon in the middle.
It's the covers all looks like the rainbow of Skittles. Like each one is a different bright Pantone color. Similar font, similar treatment. Will Stala, who designed the cover for Walkaway, has designed all these other covers. So they look stupendous, and I'm pretty delighted with how this turned out. It's pretty cool. Stala, I think, is the best designer working in New York right now. So I was pretty grateful that Tor decided to hire him to do all that stuff.
What a great tribute to your career to be able to have the new 2018 edition. That's fantastic.
It's pretty exciting.
Let me before we dive in for a second, let me just walk you back a little bit to the DMCA. Is that the right to repair battle?
Yeah, right to repair is related. Right to repair is a bunch of state level bills. There were 18 of them introduced in the last year. And because copyright is federal, there's a limit to how far you can go in a state context. States can regulate how businesses conduct themselves within their territory, but they can't change copyright law. Copyright's a federal statute. So a state could say, for example, that if you used one of these copyright locks on a car, that by law you would have to unlock it for a mechanic. What they couldn't say is, if you use one of these locks in a car, you're not allowed to sue people who unlock it. So it's kind of next best. It's faced pretty stiff headwinds. There's enormous consolidation in every sector of the economy, but especially manufacturing. So, for example, when this was up in Illinois, there were all these letters written to the lawmakers there who were contemplating this, and the lawmakers were getting these letters from industry players, like a company that makes electric shavers and a company that makes refrigerators and whatever. And in each case, they were all opposed to the right to repair. And in each case, it started with, we are the such and such electric shaver company, and 2 out of 3 of the electric shavers bought in America this year will be made by us. And their point was, like, who would know better than us how to fix an electric shaver? But of course, the other point is, we're total monopolists, and we want to extend our monopoly over manufacture into a monopoly over repair as well. And won't that be nice for us?
That'd be better for everybody, is the idea, right?
Yeah. What's good for GM is good for America, as they used to say.
Exactly. Well, please keep fighting this good fight. This is vital for all of us, including in education. And education, that's my rough bridge to our main topic. Our book club just finished reading Walk Away. I have one more post about it, reflecting on some discussion that's come up. And just briefly, friends, if you haven't read it, Walk Away takes place in the near future, where the world is divided into what is one civilization, which is called default, which looks a lot like our own, just even more intensely so. Cory just mentioned consolidation. There's a lot of consolidation, rampant income inequality, and a very frustrating life for most people. And opposed to this is what could be called walkaway civilization, where people exit default and start living on their own, sometimes in the ruins of the Rust Belt, in a world that's based on completely different principles, based on individual creativity, based on making, based on voluntary affiliation. It's almost an anarchist world. And in the middle of this novel, we learn about people learning both informally all the time, learning by making, learning by doing, learning by working with other people. But also there's even a walkaway you, where people do groundbreaking research. So I'd like to begin, Cory. The focus of the forum is the future of education and technology, and I think your novel offered a fantastic vision to that. It came out a year ago. I'm wondering if you could speak to it now. What have you learned from writing Walkaway that positions us to think about the future? Should we start looking for people to secede from civilization, exfiltrate themselves, and start new communes, co-ops, and ways of living? Or are there other lessons that we can learn from your writing?
Well, walk away, it has a lot of different dimensions, but one facet is this idea of nonviolent resistance, right? This idea that if you find yourself in an oppressive situation, rather than fighting back, you can just leave. And that if you can find enough people to leave with you, then it's not really a hardship. And so one of the recurring themes in Walk Away is that the weirdos who think that the world should be owned by a small number of oligarchs, periodically will notice that there's some walkaways colorfully living off the blighted Superfund sites in their backyards, and pronounce themselves to be the owners of those blighted Superfund sites
Right.
and demand that people give up their garbage and toxic wasteland so that the rightful owners can seize possession of them again. And the walkaways, rather than fighting, they walk away because it turns out that brownfield sites are fungible and there's
Mm-hmm.
enough toxic waste
Mm-hmm.
around for all. So one of the key elements of that is the way that walkaways use networks to coordinate themselves. There's a guy named Post who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1937. Side note here: the Nobel Prize in economics is not a Nobel Prize. It was a prize that economists created because they felt bad because they didn't get Nobels, and then they stuck Nobel's name on it. But anyway, he won the Nobel Prize in 37.
Sure.
He wrote this paper called "The Theory of the Firm," and his
Mm-hmm.
his overarching idea is that the reason we organize ourselves is so that we can get work done collectively. Uh, so that basically you have some mechanism to make sure that if you're knitting a sweater, the person next to you isn't unraveling it. And that every institution exists really to organize human labor, whether that's the Vatican or the Mafia, the US government or ISIS, Coca Cola, or your institution here, this forum, that they all exist to organize human effort because there's a limit to what one person can do. And if you want to transcend the limits of a single person, if you want to be superhuman, which transcend one person's limits, then you need to find a way to coordinate your work with other people. And the less time you spend on administrative overhead, the more you get done, the more time you have left over to get stuff done. And what networks have done is they've radically lowered the cost of coordinating ourselves. So on the one hand, they made the search costs really low. They made it really cheap for us to find people who have the same interests as us. In some ways, that's played out really well. You've got 57 people here who are interested in my novel. If you go on Facebook, you'll find groups of people who have rare diseases or non-widely held political views. Sometimes these are political views I'm very sympathetic to. Sometimes they're white supremacists, right? We've lowered those search costs dramatically, and we've lowered the collaboration costs dramatically. So today, like, if you find a million
Right.
people who want to collaborate with you on making an open operating system like a new Linux, you can then use tools like GitHub and other related collaboration tools to allow all of you to put together a operating system that's like on the order of complexity of, say, a skyscraper or like a small C program. Do it with the kind of institutional overhead that like a really ambitious little league game might have. And
Mm.
it's not to say it's like zero, but it's a
Wow.
lot lower. And so the thing that makes walking away possible is it's no fun to walk away on your own. right? Like if you're, being a hermit living in the woods, drinking your own urine is not an idyllic techno utopian lifestyle. But finding, a couple thousand people who want to build a fully automated luxury communism resort where robots do all the work and you guys sit around and play Athenium and talk philosophy and hang around in the spa, that's pretty cool, right? And it's a matter of like lowering the search costs and then lowering the collaboration costs, and then you can make it happen. So
Yes.
clearly, we're living in both the bright and the dark version of that uh, low collaboration, low search costs, right? Like all the xenophobia, all the racism, all the extreme political views, it's all coming out of low search costs and low collaboration costs. Because like one of the things about these insurgent movements, both the ones that I like and the ones that I oppose, is they tend not to have a lot of organizational facility. They don't have a lot of organizational nous. They're not great at organizing themselves. It's one of the reasons the internet has been historically really good at getting rid of bad stuff, but not making new, good, enduring institutions. Is they're pretty disjoint skill set. Like it's one thing to get 2,000 Filipinos to show up for the Popular Power March, by using SMSs to organize themselves and get rid
Yes.
of a corrupt president. It's another thing to get them to vote for a good president. It's hard. So walk away from thinking about that hard part, and maybe we see little green shoots of it popping up here and there. I mean, Occupy endured for 5 years.
Right.
Burning camps tend to have some stability. My camp is 20 years old this year. And so these kind of semi ad hoc, non authoritarian, low institutional overhead, positive, enduring institutions, that's pretty exciting. And that I think is like something that we're not going to see any less of. We're actually just going to see more and more profound effects from, and
Hmm.
more intense outcomes, more intense clashes, more people with weird views, some of which will like turn around and go, "Hey, it's so cool that like something that was considered beyond the pale, like fat acceptance or neurotypical acceptance or
Hmm.
trans acceptance, that those things have become part of our mainstream dialogue." And then we're going to turn around and go, "Oh my God, flat earthing is a thing?" Because people who have like odd view, the weirdness of your view is not necessarily a good predictor of the goodness of your view, and either or the badness of your view. And so the internet makes it easy for people who have weird views to find each other. Some of those views
Yes.
will be terrible views, and they will form lasting, sustaining insurgencies that will argue that the world is flat.
If at best, and there are far more worse. So it's Yoshai Benkler's world. We just live in it. Um,
Yeah,
but
yeah. Benkler, he
before
wrote me a quote for the book. It's a
yes,
very Benklerish book.
it is. Well, before I dive into questions, we have a question from Nate Angel. Tara, if you can bring him up on stage, please. Let's see if we can bring him in. Um, and while we do that, friends, if you have other questions, comments, again, remember there's three different ways we could do it. If you haven't used the video option, uh, this is how we get to do it right now. Nate, can you hear us?
I can, Brian. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, perfectly. Greetings and welcome.
Greetings to you and to Cory as well. Hey, I wanted to maybe provide another way of thinking about a segue to education. And if I understand it correctly, Cory, you've licensed some of your own creative works under open licenses, including some that even allow derivatives. And if that's so, I'm wondering if it would be interesting to connect the idea of the right to repair to the idea of students and educators repairing, quote unquote, your own creative works by working with them in their openly licensed formats.
Great idea. Please,
Yeah,
please.
I think that's, I mean, I think that the idea that we teach students by asking them to, I don't know if you could call it like seizing the means of information, but, grabbing a hold of the cultural works that they're swimming in and making new ones, it's a pretty well established idea in pedagogy, right? Like if you're learning to play the piano, they don't say, right, write some new songs and practice those. They say,
Right.
go and practice the songs that you're interested in. Now, I think that there's an interesting parable in the difference between how we teach writing, say, and how we teach piano, because I think the same pedagogic principle is at work, that you learn to write by rewriting the stuff that matters to you. You know, my early forays into fiction were Star Wars fan fiction and Conan fan fiction. That's how I became the
Yes.
writer I am. You know, I had writing teachers who said, "Oh, you're writing too much like Harlan Ellison this month," or whatever, and it was because I was figuring out who I was by trying on other people's writing. It's a legitimate thing, and I think that there's a reading of copyright law and fair use that says that's just how it works. However, we have this combination of um, expanded copyright law and a corollary, which is that we're really timid about challenging that expansion, that has us limiting ourselves to open license work when we assign students to do that kind of remix. And I think that that is like that was historically the thing that people worried about with open licenses for traditional copyright, is that
Mhm.
rather than open licenses being a way to expand the pool of things that you could do, it would be a de facto narrowing, because anything that was an open license would be considered off limits for it. And you know, one of the things that I've discovered, having released a lot of material under Creative Commons, is that people routinely write to me and say, "I know that you've licensed this under Creative Commons, but I want to get your permission anyway." And so even under open license, it's very hard to get away from this idea. And you know, there are lots of reasons that we allow for unauthorized use. Some are this like pedagogic purpose of advancing, you know, a field or an art form. But another important one is that it's part of the essential escape valve for free expression under copyright regimes. You know, it's an odd beast to square up with the U.S. constitutional tradition, because you have the First Amendment that says, you know, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of expression, and then you have the Progress Clause in the Constitution that says, to promote the useful arts and sciences, Congress may establish monopolies of limited time to writers over their writing. Well, it's very hard not to have a plain language reading of copyright, of that Progress Clause, a monopoly over who can recite your words, that isn't Congress making a law limiting how you can express yourself. And in fact, this has gone to the Supreme Court. So in two cases, Golan and Eldred, the Supreme Court was asked how copyright and the First Amendment interact with each other. And the Supreme
Yeah.
said copyright needs to allow for unauthorized expressive uses, and it needs to hew to the traditional contours. It can't expand beyond the traditional domain of copyright. Otherwise, any copyright statute that fails to meet those two criteria doesn't pass constitutional muster, and this court will strike them down. And I think that to that purpose, right, if we're going to say, like, let us defend free expression, we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to seeking permission or looking for permission that's been granted in advance by open licensing. We need to take some risks. We need to actually push against the limits of fair use and fair dealing and say, we are going to make this use specifically because it's not permitted. And you know, the Supreme Court has weighed in on this question, not just in Eldred and Golan, but very famously in the case about the novel The Wind Done Gone, which was a retelling of Gone with the Wind from the perspective of the enslaved Africans, who are minor characters in Gone with the Wind. And Margaret Mitchell's estate sued the African American author who wrote that book. And the court basically said, like, you can't ask a critic to seek permission from the person they're criticizing, because that will be generally withheld. And so for us to have a robust culture of critical discourse, there has to be unpermitted use. And so pedagogically, while it's nice to have the avoidance of doubt that arises from open licenses or explicit permission given, I think that there's a second pedagogical purpose, which is to teach students not to fall into the timid habit of only proceeding where permission has been given.
Asking forgiveness afterwards is better than getting permission ahead of time.
Yeah.
My first exposure to copyright was when I was about 5 years old, looking at sheet music and holding up a Xerox copy, which at the bottom said, "Do not photocopy." I remember asking my teachers, "Wait a minute, isn't that how they shh, keep playing the cello?"
Yeah.
Okay.
I do like this analogy. Oh, sorry, Cory, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I like your musical analogy. It's like no one asked for permission to butcher Bach on the piano when they first start playing, right?
Sure. Yeah, and so I think that historically copyright has been a regime for regulating the supply chain of the entertainment industry, right? The way that we make copyright law is we usually look at what the entertainment industry does and then we turn it into law. And that's fine, provided the only people being asked to obey it are in the entertainment industry. And the way that we check to see whether you are in the entertainment industry is whether you are making or handling a copy of a work. And generally speaking, if you were doing that, you were part of the industry because like you couldn't copy a book without a printing press. So you had some industrial apparatus, chances are you were in the industry. And where we talked about things like photocopying around the periphery, it was not only was it like small potatoes, but it was also largely undetectable, right? Like, how was
Right.
the sheet music publisher going to find out that your piano teacher had photocopied some sheet music? And so the
Right.
enforcement was pretty non-existent. And now we have the internet. The internet works by making copies, and so everybody makes like 1,000 copies before breakfast. That doesn't make them part of the entertainment industry. And as someone who is in the entertainment industry and relies on having a well developed technical framework to regulate my relations with other parties to my industry, other members of the supply chain, I don't want something that's so simple that your 12-year-old students can follow it, because it will be of no use to me in negotiating things with the multinational corporations that I have to deal with in order to pay my bills, right? Nor do I expect your 12-year-old students to understand something that is designed to be interpreted by the lawyers of multinational corporations. It's a fantasy to believe that someday we will get children to understand copyright law. That's ridiculous. That's like saying someday, before receiving their pocket money every week, your kids will understand SEC regulations. If you have to understand SEC regulations to get your allowance, we have a huge regulatory problem. And if we simplify them to the point where every kid who gets allowance can obey them, then finance is going to run rampant. So we
Yeah.
really just need to make sure that it's not that we don't need industrial regulations. We just don't need industrial regulations applied to people who aren't in the industry.
Mm. That's a great parallel. Thank you. Thank you, Nate, for a great question. Thank you, Cory, for that passionate answer. Before I jump in, there's another question we have, and this is a question from Phil Katz. This is a text question. So, Tara, if you could flash that up. Thank you. Phil asks, since Cory's introduced economic theory, has he been influenced by Albert Hirschman's classic work, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty? Walkaway sounds like a version of Exit.
No, I haven't read it, although you're not the first person to mention it to me. It's certainly in my list. I think that I probably drunk the twice brewed tea of Hoffman, in that I'm sure he's influenced a lot of the writers that I've read. And that I think that's one of the great things about discovering a new discipline, or becoming more aware of a new discipline, is often you encounter their work first through a contemporary interpreter of the work, and then you start to recognize that there's a kind of tree from which this branch descends, and you move back and further, and you start to get an understanding not just of the contemporary state of play, but at the context in which it emerges. And that's great. I think the only risk is that like sometimes you just end up drinking the twice brewed tea and you never go back and find your own tea bags. There's a great Bruce Sterling quote from a speech he gave to the Game Developers Conference, where he exhorts them to stop reading supermarket fantasy novels to get their fantasy worlds, because they're drinking Tolkien's twice brewed tea, and that they should go back to those mythos that Tolkien read to write Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And I think it's sound advice. And not coincidentally, Neil Gaiman had a New York Times bestseller this year by just retelling the Norse mythos instead of retelling Jack Kirby's retelling of the Norse mythos.
Yes, quite. Well, thank you. One of the things you'll find at the forum is that we have a bibliography that grows and grows as we have more and more recommendations. Phil, thank you very, very much for doing that. What Phil did, by the way, was he just, on the white strip on the bottom of the screen, he just clicked that question mark with a circle around it. And what Nate did was he clicked that raised hand button. And what some of you are already doing is clicking the chat box and throwing in tons and tons of questions and comments. In fact, Cory, we already had a comment and a little discussion about the Paolo Soleri's Arcosanti project. And Mark Corbett Wilson has been asking or commenting about that, talking about how many people actually worked there. And yet no one has replicated the arcologies, which is an interesting observation.
Yeah, there sure are a lot of ways to fail.
Yes, yes, there are.
And I think that Solari is the kind of he's the kind of rare failure who wasn't erased from the historic record. So, I've been to archaeology, and certainly like the arcology endures as a kind of like instantly recognizable graphic motif. When you see those cutaway drawings, you just, even if you've never encountered Solari, like the work. I think mostly people who fail just sink without a trace. And so we have this kind of hindsight bias, I think, where since everyone that we've heard of, plus or minus, is someone who succeeded, we tend to overestimate the likelihood that people with good ideas will succeed, because all the good ideas that fail generally have been like so thoroughly erased that we don't even know that they were ever posed. But Solari's the interesting case where he's betwixt and between. He left an enduring, indelible record and made it a long-standing mark on the world, even though he never kind of reached critical mass. And so it's tempting to think of him as being kind of an abject failure. And I like to think of him as having been one of the most successful failures we've had. And that he was in that fraction of failures who we still think about, as opposed to the ones that were swallowed.
What's that film? Is it Meet the Robinsons, when they have a celebration of another glorious failure? I always like that.
No, I don't know that one, but yeah, sure. Yeah.
We have
I mean, I worked in a used bookstore, and one of the things about working in a used bookstore as a science fiction writer, as an inspiring writer, is that you see these books that were wildly successful that are coming in the used section that no one has ever heard of. So like there will be writers who wrote like a novel a year every year, and every one of them on the paperback says #1 New York Times bestseller, and there's 20 of them from 20 consecutive years of New York Times bestsellerdom. No one's heard of the guy, and he's only been dead for 10 years, right? Like that's just, there's a lot of stuff in the world, and it's very hard to remember all of it.
Well, and maybe we can do something with that. Tom Hames wants to join us from Texas. Tara, if we can bring Tom up, please, and let's see if we can fit him into the video panel. And meanwhile, friends, be careful. I'm going to start asking more and more questions if you don't. We already have a couple right now. Nate thinks that you were his clerk at the Strand in New York City in 1983.
Nope. Toronto.
Say wrong city.
It's New York under the Swiss.
Well, while we're bringing up Tom, let me ask you a question that springs off of this. There's been some interesting discussion in the educational technology world this year about the limits of open, and the discussion doesn't come about from economics. It comes about from the dangers of abuse online. Let me hold that now that we have Tom. Let me let Tom run with his question.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Tom.
Awesome.
Welcome.
So, my dog just went off, of course. Hi, Cory. I was deeply. Your walk away has made me think harder and deeper about a lot of things over the last year, and one of the things that I have been really chewing on, shall we say, is moving from an analog world to a digital world. And the idea being that in an industrial world, everything was keyed up around processes. It's like a cassette tape. You play that out, and at the end of that, you get a car or a product of something, And all our institutions are set up around these linear processes. You go through school, you get your university education, you get your degree, you get a job, you retire, and you get Social Security, if you're lucky. But what I'm thinking, what's really got me thinking about so many of these things where we have this discordance right now is this idea that the digital world doesn't obey those rules. That if something gets in your way, if the analogy I made in the chat room, if the government gets in your way because you're on a certain road, you just build a new road, and that's essentially what Walkaway is talking about. And but there was from our esteemed host, a little bit of pushback is that does digital, is it more likely to be anarchic
or is it more likely to be despotic? And my personal feeling on it is it's anarchic. At the end of the day, you can just build what you need and get around what the stupid stuff is. I mean, if John Deere says you can't fix their tractors, you download the Ukrainian software, right? I'd like to hear what you have to think about that.
Sure. Well, that's a good question. I think that that we should go back to COAS here. We should go back to coordination. That the reason to make linear processes is because the cost of re-coordinating with people is very high. So if you're going to, if you need a pipeline of trained mechanical engineers, in Dearborn, Michigan in 10 years, you need to start the process now. And there's a bunch of steps you have to hit to produce that trained workforce, to produce the cars, to do the thing. And to know to a nicety that you're going to need cars in 10 years, you also need to coordinate a bunch of other things about like where you're going to build and what kind of roads you're going to build and so on. And changing your mind later on, it's really hard, right? It requires going back to a bunch of people and making sure they get the message, sometimes applying moral suasion and getting them to agree that they should undo the work they've done or change course. But even if you can command them, you might have to retrain them or whatever. And one of the things that we get with networks is a nimbleness that allows us to do binding in our processes. And the reason we have brittle, tightly constrained, well-defined processes is not because they're the best, it's because they're the least worst way to minimize wastage and conflict and all the other problems that you get. No matter what, you'll have some engineers at the end. Maybe you'll have an oil shock in the 1970s and those engineers won't have any cars to build, but at least by God, you will have some engineers in Dearborn, Michigan 10 years from now if you do everything right. And when you lower the cost of collaboration, make it easier for people to push together and pull apart different kinds of expertise, different kinds of project-oriented work gangs or teams, and then you have access to a lot more responsive and flexible and fluid way of thinking about things. Now, as to whether that means that we're headed for something great or something terrible, the dystopia or utopia. One of the things that I, as a science fiction writer, know is that predicting the future is like a crazy thing to try and do. and that none of us know it's great. And like, if there's one thing we can learn from science fiction, it's that we don't do better than a random number generator, right? Like, we've made millions of guesses, only a very tiny number of them have come true.
I like how Neil Stephenson puts it as speculative fiction rather than science fiction.
Yeah.
You're playing with ideas.
Yeah, and I think that maybe you're helping to shape the future because you're changing the way people think about what the future could be, right? You're intervening in that way. But like, if I thought the future is predictable, I wouldn't even get out of bed, right? Like, what could be more fatalistic than believing that the future was going to arrive inevitably? But moreover, say you thought that like odds were that technology was to take away our power of self-determination instead of giving it to us, and that it was going to create a kind of dystopian, authoritarian state managed by a combination of disinformation and control technologies and surveillance. You should get up every morning and do everything you can to prevent that from happening, right? Because that's a terrible world to bequeath to our children. And if you thought that that wasn't going to happen, and then in like 20 years, we'd look back and go, remember Mark Zuckerberg? Wasn't he a freak? Can you remember when, we had crazy disinformation campaigns and DRM and all kinds of bad stuff? Boy, did we dodge a bullet. You should get up every morning and do everything you can to make that world happen, because the stakes are so high if it doesn't that we can't afford to just kind of take it. And so rather than like making a prediction about whether technology will be good or bad for humanity, I'm way more interested in what we can do to make it less bad and more good. And to that end, sometimes I'm making these normative interventions in the form of stories that are meant to make people think about the risks and the possibilities and try to avoid the risks and advance the possibilities. Sometimes it's policy stuff and trying to get, expert agencies or lawmakers to do the right thing. And I've sometimes dabbled in commercial stuff where I've been involved in businesses that tried to do well by doing good. And sometimes it's legal stuff, right? Sometimes it's asking states to put aside bad ideas and embrace good ones. But I think that we work on those four axes. Larry Lessig identified: code, law, norms, and markets. We work on these to try to make the world more good and less bad, because the stakes are too high not to do both of those things, no matter what your theory is about how it's likely to all turn out. In the same way that, like, you are almost certainly not going to get into a car accident today, but you should still wear your seatbelt because the consequences are so high. If you have a wreck and you're not wearing your seatbelt, maybe we will. Maybe you think that we won't have a bad future. Maybe you think that we will, but you should still do everything you can to make it as good as possible.
Well, so you're saying I'm right to be optimistic and Brian is wrong to be pessimistic. I got it. Thank you.
I'm saying you should be hopeful, right? Hope is the belief that, like, if you do something, you might improve your situation, right? As opposed to fatalistic, the belief that the dice have been rolled.
I've always called myself a naive realist.
I like that.
So
sure.
I go through world, I can dream, but then I have to figure out how to make the dreams happen. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom, for the good questions, even if you're wrong. And thank you, Cory, for the brilliant answer. I'm just delighted at how many topics you managed to hit on in just a few minutes. We had another question coming up. I think this is from, let's see, we had a text question from Mike Sharkey. And Mike observed, you wrote Makers in 2009. Do you think the makerspace is it now where you thought it would be back in 2009?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. So I think that some things have turned out better than I expected in 2009. Open source hardware is a much bigger commercial success than I imagined it would be, and it has successfully resisted attempts to close it, or what we would call the environmental movement greenwash it, except this would be like proprietary washing it. So, Arduino had this brief period where they put in this new CEO who was just terrible and who was like filing all these trademarks and stuff. And the community rose up against it, and he's out on his ass now. And so that's been great. I think that one of the things that we've experienced since the growth of makerspaces is a continuation of the monotonic reduction of free time. And makerspaces were largely about spending free time well. And I think that economic precarity and the rise of the gig economy, where every moment is filled, I think that we now just have a lot less free time, and kids whose free time has been in free fall forever. I think that now there's even less of it. I'm the father of a 10-year-old who's just about to start middle school, and her schedule's already very full, and that's just full with things that, like, she sees her friends doing and wants to do. We haven't even gotten into the, oh my God, will you be economic roadkill if we don't sign you up for these 15 after-school activities? And so that, I think, was dismally predictable in 2009, and it's certainly come true today. There's just not as much time for play and exploration and all of that.
And we need more of that. We need a lot more of that. Phil, a whole bunch of observations that come by and a few jokes in the chat box. Phil Long wants to know where he can program free time into his schedule. Jonathan Poritz likes your phrase, normative interventions in the form of stories. And you had various fans shouting out great notes. Mike Richichi says, what I like about your work is that you do a good job taking trends of today and extrapolating them just enough to be plausible, but also futuristic. Speaking of Phil Long, we had a question from him. Terry, what do we put that on the screen? The epitome of walkaway evolution is the uploaded human. Initially, uploads struggle with stability given the separation from their bodies. At the end, they seem to achieve transcendence. Is that your vision?
It's my plot resolution. It's a thought experiment. In fact, it's a thought experiment about thought experiments. That
Literally,
whole plot, yeah, that whole plot element, and it builds on something Charlie Strauss and I wrote in our novel Rapture of the Nerds. This idea that a lot of what contemporary self-improvement, psychotherapy, and mindfulness is about, it's kind of grounded in, I guess, CBT is a good framework for thinking about it, cognitive behavioral therapy. This idea that like there's what
yes.
there's what you're thinking about what you're thinking, and maybe you can't change what you're thinking, but you can change how you feel about what you're thinking. You can recognize, oh, I'm angry at that person because I didn't have enough sleep. You still feel angry, but you have this sort of executive function that says, don't pay attention to the anger. And
Yeah.
when you become a human-like software, then that becomes much more explicit. You could imagine a dial that you turn to say, don't worry about your existential crisis. Now, the thing that the novel explores is something that I think is the limit of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is how much of that you can do before you reach the limits of who you are as a person, right? There comes a point where it's like, the terrible thing that person just said about the person I love very much. I know that I'm angry at that person for saying it because of my affinity for the subject of their insult. But depending on the person and the insult, you might just reach a point where it's like, even intellectually, as much as I know that I'm experiencing an irrationally intense reaction to this, you might just hit the limits of like how much you can do something about that, right? You just might just be angry, and if you weren't angry, you wouldn't be you. And what the software entities in Walkaway are doing is they're trying to walk this fine line between being them and living the serenity prayer, accepting the things they can't change, the things they can't, and having the wisdom to know the difference. And we don't know really what it means to be us, because we've never had to ask ourselves if we're still us when we're not in another body or whatever. We have minor versions of that, right? You have the pianist whose hands get caught in a threshing machine, who then has to say, am I still me if I can't play the piano?
Right.
But we don't have this as a kind of widespread, nuanced question that we have to confront existentially. And so it was a fun thought experiment. And then, the story resolves itself with them having made peace with it. And the kind of subtext of that, I think, is that everyone who couldn't make peace with it is dead, right? Because like their bodies reached the end of how long they could repair themselves. And since they couldn't stomach being software in a bottle, that was it, right? We have this, like, we've gone through this cognitive genetic bottleneck of everyone who can't adapt to being being in that situation is dead. In the same way, some people think that all the drink beer during the plague years, when the only was safe to drink had been boiled in the process of making it into beer, they all died of alcoholism. And then everybody who lives is someone who can tolerate beer. There's lots of people very critical of that account, in part because it tends to have this other subtext that indigenous people in the Americas have some genetic deficiency that alcoholism, and that it's not like rampant immiseration and having their land stolen and being sent to rape camps for generations and so on that causes the traumatic addiction. It's even if the white man hadn't done all those terrible things, we would still have this problem, and we can't really blame us, and still of that account. But you see the analogy, which is that if there is a strong selective pressure, if everybody who can't do X dies, then by definition, everyone who's still around at the end of the process is probably okay with X.
There's a Joe Haldeman novel, I think it's Mind Bridge, where after a point we humans are replaced by humans who can do a kind of telepathic empathy combination with others, and those who can't are dead. So the resolution is pretty clear. Makes you think of Neanderthals. But let me pause for a second. I hate to pause you. I feel like I'm wading into a fountain and saying, hang on a second, this is beautiful and glorious. But where almost at the end of our hour. In the chat box, people have cut loose. We have an extraordinary discussion. People are ramping between everything from pathetic dot theory to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to speculative non-Buddhism to Michael Pollan's new book to this book about zebras and unicorns, which I don't know. It sounds like your plot device of going to uploading and then transcendence has really struck a chord. Let me get in one last question as the host of this, and let me ask if you could. I know what you said about futurism, and I know exactly how difficult it is to predict. But if you could look ahead for the next 10 years for education, what would you hope for us to achieve? What kind of directions would you hope for education to go in?
Well, if there's one thing that I would like to see restored to its former glory, it's the idea of unstructured self-directed learning. And I have a bias because I thrive in those environments. I went to unstructured self-directed schools, and I spent the fourth grade just doing math, and I spent the second grade just reading, and I spent I spent 7 years in high school. I spent 1 year of it living in Mexico writing, and another year in the streets protesting the first Gulf War. And the ability to do that kind of self-directed education was really important to who I became. And as the father of someone going into middle school, I despair for the degree of structure and the limits on her ability to just pursue her interests where they take her. Uh, and I don't know a single teacher who likes that regime either. And I think it's largely the product of this kind of neoliberal accountability thing that includes the high stakes testing regimes and No Child Left Behind. I'm all for benchmarks and I'm all for assessment and I'm all for figuring out where kids need help and giving them the help using tools. But we very quickly go from education as a human right and as part of human flourishing into a product that is supposed to produce standardized work units, and it's really bad.
So we need to stop that. We need to stop that hard.
Yeah.
But then the second part, if I can loop back a little bit, is we're talking about this in terms of networking and of people growing together and of being open with each other. But now the past 5 years or so have shown that humans have developed even new capacities for being terrible to each other with digital technologies. Everything from Gamergate to the troll armies that sweep the world. How can we proceed? That is, for example, there's one argument which says what we should do is we should retreat from open. We should return to strong copyright. We should return to walled off preserves because that's the best way to protect especially vulnerable populations from harm.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what we should be doing, or should we redefine open, or what?
So let's divide the problem into two pieces. One is how do we make sure that we can find solutions and try them, and the other one is which solutions should we try. And the how do we find solutions requires everybody to be able to try things, right? It requires that you, if you're being harassed, to be able to either develop or work with someone who's developing anti-harassment tools and use them in the environments where you're being harassed so that you can mute or blunt or report or counter whatever it is that's bothering you. And then there's the question of like, what should you do? Which intervention might reduce bullying or harassment or whatever? I don't take a strong view on the second part. I don't know. But I do know that the only way that we get there is by allowing people to try stuff. I don't think Apple has a monopoly, or Google or Twitter or Facebook has a monopoly on good ideas about how to avoid harassment, not least because even with the best of will, those firms are driven by economies of scale. If they have a tool that works for 99% of people and you're in the 1% that it doesn't work for, don't hold your breath. Right. And, there's a corollary here to, say, disability and accessibility tools. Everybody who has a disability is disabled in some unique sui generis way. Right. And so we can say, OK, well, we have good artificial limbs, but we still have to fit them. And then even after we fit them, everybody responds to them in different ways because they have different degrees of remaining limb. They have different kind of neural material that's left intact, muscular material that's left intact, or whatever. If you are someone with photosensitive epilepsy, we can generally mute the amount of strobing that the movies that you watch do. But everyone with photosensitive epilepsy has a different range that they're sensitive to. And if you want to prevent seizures, what you really want to do is calibrate that anti-strobe effect to the individual limits and abilities of the person with photosensitive epilepsy. And so you have to allow people to configure the tools that they use, to allow people to solve the problems that they have, or work together with other people to solve the problems that they have, or elect a proxy to solve their problem. Otherwise, what you're saying is, if you are not in the range of people whom a single manufacturer agrees is worth solving a problem for, then your problem will never be solved. And we are none of us normal, right? We're none of us statistically average. When the idea of biometric averages was created and we started taking standardized measurements of people's limbs and so on, we produced these standard manuals of human measurement. And the US Army tried making uniforms that were standard sizes. They didn't fit anyone because the mean is not reflective of any one individual. It's the, perfectly spherical cow of uniform density on a frictionless surface. That's lovely for a thought experiment, but it doesn't tell you anything about any one particular cow. And so if we're going to have a system that works for all of us, it has to let all of us change that system.
That is a fantastic vision. And I hate to say it, but it's a fantastic vision for us to end upon. We are right at the end of the hour, and you are waiting for someone to ring your doorbell, or not?
That's right. Yeah, my laptop repair guy. I've blown out another keyboard, so my laptop repair guy is about to show up. The one
Cory,
thing I'll Lenovo for $150 for 3 years. They'll show up at your house with your laptop.
It's a good deal, but I have to say, being between Cory Doctorow and laptop repair does sound like some kind of proverbial hard place for the 21st century.
For sure.
Let me thank you so much for this fantastic discussion.
I had a lovely time too. Thanks to everyone on the line.
We'll share the recording and also share the chat box because it's incredible. And your child will be fantastic in middle school. I'll be happy to talk about it if you want.
All right, great.
And we look forward to reading the rest of your books for those of us who haven't read everything yet. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I really had a lovely time. I'll talk to you later.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
And friends, don't leave yet, friends. We have to talk about the next couple of weeks and where things are going. Let me just say, first of all, this is extraordinary. I'm rethinking and thinking about where the forum could go in the future, and it was inspiring and mindfulling to hear everything from all of you. Thank you so much. Next week, we change gears, and we have another journalist. The forum has had many journalists on as guests. This time it's Doug Belkin from the Wall Street Journal. He's the Wall Street Journal's higher education reporter. And he's been doing great work looking at higher education sustainability, access, student debt, student loans. So I'm really looking forward to meeting with him on the 24th, and you should be as well. Now, speaking of reading and looking forward to things, our book club is just finished, Walk Away. If you haven't finished Walk Away yet, I'm sure Cory has inspired you to plunge into it. The blog has all of that discussion there, and we'll have at least one more post this week, so please join us. That's it for right now. If you'd like to continue the conversation, we're all over social media. I would love to hear more about your thoughts. Once again, thank you so much for all of this. We'll see you online, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.